Let's explore a number of deployment strategy options. And we're going to start by exploring locations. Locations are important and need to be taken into account very early on in the cloud deployment strategy. And it is important, for example, to consider where your users are located because it may actually make sense to place resources close to where they are in order to reduce latency. And obviously, this also depends on where the cloud provider of choice has physical infrastructure. So you may need to select a cloud provider that has a local presence in specific areas due to geographical proximity to your end users. For example, there are other requirements that may govern the choice of cloud provider. For example, regulatory constraints that require services to be deployed in specific geographical regions or in specific countries. And certain organizations have global services, services that have a global audience. And so the importance of having a low latency network that allows access to services distributed across multiple regions could be a major consideration. Now, in addition to location, it's also important to think about resource management. And many cloud platforms have different tools and capabilities that are made available to you in order to facilitate resource management. For example, upfront, you may want to think about the different roles that require access, and you may also want to determine which of those roles need to be created as custom roles. You may actually have roles that may not be easy to support with the capabilities that are available out of the box. When thinking about roles, also consider the level of access for those specific roles and how you're going to manage those roles, right? So what's the governance around those highly privileged roles? Some clouds provide the ability for you to map resources to a structure that's very similar to your organizational structure. And this makes it a little bit easier for you to essentially assign policies. You can assign policies at a level which is very similar to how your organization is structured. It is also important to give resource labeling careful consideration because resource labels can make filtering and organizing resources in the cloud a lot easier. Having discussed resource management, let's take a look at cloud identity access management. Very important to think about how you're going to assign escalated privileges, for example, administration access to users of the cloud. Many organizations have existing LDAP systems. Also important to consider how you're going to federate information within existing LDAPs, for example, Active Directory to the cloud. Additionally, it's a lot easier to assign roles to groups than it is to actually manage the assignment of roles to individual members. So giving due consideration to group membership and role assignment upfront is a sensible approach. It is also important to think about the access control governance process. For example, are there specific constraints or conditions that govern access to certain parts of the infrastructure? And finally, for very highly sensitive roles, it may actually make sense to implement two-factor authentication. Let's move on and talk about compute. Compute services are obviously very, very important on the cloud. And one of the things that might be sensible to do upfront is to give careful thought to the types of use cases and ensure that the compute service which is being selected is suitable for the particular use case. For example, is the application monolithic or is it a distributed application? There are certain compute services that are more suited to distributed applications on the cloud. Is the application stateful or stateless? So depending on the type of workload, you may select particular services that are purposely designed for those types of workloads. Is the application containerized or is it a legacy application? There are a number of services in the cloud which are optimized for container-based workloads. And finally, instance access management is another important consideration. Does the instance need to be accessible outside of a VPC, or is access going to be from within the internal network? Networking is another very important area of consideration. And from a networking perspective, you may want to give consideration to the inter or intra network traffic requirements. For example, do you need an encrypted channel of communication between services running within a cluster? Do you need hybrid connectivity between the on-premises network and the VPC in the cloud? What about segmentation? Do you want to create individual networks for specific applications, or do you want to create networks based on teams? Also important to consider compute resource constraints. For example, the use of virtual machines with internal IP address only that need to be accessible from outside of the network, or that need to be updated by connecting to update services which are also outside of the VPC. Are there specific audit logs that need to be enabled? What's the retention period? Do we need to configure specific alerts based on specific metrics that are related to networking? And are there specific requirements from the point of view of access control? And in addition to networking, we also have storage considerations. Storage services are very important on the cloud. And some of the considerations include capacity. Different storage services have different capacities, and they're designed for specific use cases. We also need to take into account access modes. Are the services read-write or read-only? Is the service going to be accessed once a year, which is typical for archival type of workloads? Is it an application-based workload that accesses the storage system more frequently? And is the data cacheable? And if so, for how long? Can we use a content distribution system in order to reduce latency and cost? Is the data sensitive in nature? Does it have to be encrypted? What is the encryption process and governance? Can we use a key management service within the cloud to manage the lifecycle of the keys? Or do we need to store the keys outside of the cloud and supply the keys as and when required? What about monitoring and access control? Are there specific requirements for monitoring? And from monitoring and access control perspective, are there requirements in terms of auditing or maybe log retention? Is it okay for us to restrict access at a bucket level, or do we need to restrict access at an individual object level? And these are just examples of storage deployment strategy considerations that need to be taken into account. And we can extend the conversation to databases as well. And from a database point of view, there are different types of databases that are available on the cloud. For example, do we need a database that deals with structured data or unstructured data? Do we need a relational database management service? Do we need a NoSQL database service? Do we need a document store? Those are all options that are available to us. What about latency? Are there specific requirements for latency? Is there a need to have replication across multiple zones in order to have a high availability configuration? Is there a need for global consistency in terms of relational database management services? Are there specific legacy dependencies? Do we need to deploy specific versions of a database or specific types of databases? What about access to the database? Is it sufficient for us to configure an authorized network? Can we assign a public IP address to the instance, or is the instance going to be accessible only within the internal network, in which case an internal IP address only is sufficient? And finally, from an analytics point of view, there are a number of additional considerations that could be made. For example, is the data going to be ingested at high velocity? Does the data need to be transformed and analyzed? Does it need to be cleansed? What does the extract transformation load pipeline look like? What service is ideal for implementing such a pipeline? Are there specific data formats that need to be supported, and what systems would be ideal for supporting those formats? What about the size and expected growth? Different systems on the cloud have different capacities. And so this could determine the most suitable type of system on the cloud. Some systems have machine learning capabilities. So if there's a requirement for machine learning, it may actually skew the focus towards specific types of services. And from a batch processing point of view, what type of jobs are required? Are there specific SLAs that have an impact on the type of workflow configuration? And from a monitoring point of view, what type of metrics need to be monitored? Are there alerts that need to be generated? Are there logs that need to be aggregated? And finally, can we actually achieve our goals using a managed service as opposed to having to take on the burden of managing the infrastructure or the platform ourselves? So these are all considerations that are worth taking into account upfront before we embark on implementing services on the cloud. Later in this series, we're going to revisit the deployment strategy considerations we've just discussed and define specific best practice solutions for achieving the optimal solution in the cloud.